Okay, options. Excellent. Hello, everyone. Hello. Just want to talk today. Let me just get my picture up. Apologies for these 10 seconds of. You should, generally speaking, skip the first 10 seconds of most of my videos. So, I want to talk today about the first encounter between Romeo and Juliet, which to me is, there's a tragedy to this encounter, which is, it is the greatest meet cute of literary history, in my opinion. Greatest wit and charm offensive to lovers mount. And it is extraordinary in terms of the literary conventions of the time. It's extraordinary in many, many ways. But at the same time, the tragedy is students nowadays find the Shakespearean language very challenging, and there's a lot of references to religion which are not as clear-cut as they would have been to an Elizabethan audience. So some of the puns will get lost, and I kind of want to walk you through the dialogue as well. But my main concern is, because of the GCSE tasks that are coming up, and because so much of it is how does it fit into a literary context, how does the form reflect on the view of gender, the view of idealization. We'll talk about both of those. And there isn't really much to do here with violence, so that prompt we can leave behind for the moment. But I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that they are speaking one of the things that makes this the greatest meet cute is they complete a sonnet together, which is fairly rare, and we will see why. But independently of it being rare, there's so much you could do with this in your coursework that it's worth staying a while, especially if you're not doing the violence prompt. This is the perfect video for you. Because generally speaking, I've read articles about this, and I've read other teachers' comments, and it's very easy to just go, look, this shows how perfect they are for each other, how meant to be they are, how well suited they are to one another, that they can immediately complete a sonnet together and rhyme with each other. They literally rhyme with each other. They clearly are connected. There's nothing wrong with this, but to me, that's the outer layer of a very, very deep and rich core, which is basically these 14 lines, beyond being the cutest of the meet cutes, are a revolution in the sonnet form, which you wouldn't expect, but there is really a turning over its head of all the conventions of the sonnet form, practically. So, starting off with taking a form usually of one voice and giving it two. Sonnets are written by poets to, very often in that period, their loved ones. This is written in the heyday of the sonnet period, the 1590s, when Shakespeare wrote most of his sonnets, though they got published later, and where Sidney writes his sonnets, Spenser writes his sonnets, everybody writes sonnets. It's a fad, basically. The sonnets become a fad. There's 17 famous collections of sonnets from that one decade. And I think to a degree, the sonnet form never has such popularity again, like just as predominance over the poetic mind, where every poet feels like, okay, I need to write sonnets now. It's an extraordinary moment. And Shakespeare, you read in his sonnets already, he has certain problems. All sonneteers have problems with the sonnet form. What are sonnets? 14 lines, very particular rhyme scheme, very particular meter. And generally speaking, in Shakespeare's time, mostly devoted to love and courtly themes, and making an argument to be loved by the person you love, and to complain about the pain of not being loved back. And in a way, it would make a lot more sense for the unrequited Petrarchan lover Romeo to speak in sonnets, to write sonnets, much as he speaks in oxymorons or oxymora, like his Petrarchan ideal, much as he plays with his own victimhood, much like Petrarch did in his sonnets. But Shakespeare says, no, no, no. I want to save my sonnet writing for when I can make a big difference. So, the one voice giving it to is going to be really meaningful to the discussion of idealizing love. If it's just Romeo, then we basically have, imagine Juliet didn't say anything, we would just basically have Romeo saying, since I'm soiling your holy hands with mine, let me clean them up with my lips. Which is an intriguing little concept. Romeo is nothing if not inventive and creative. And then he would just say, he would kind of say, well, it's basically, he would make a claim, let me just do it, and he will spell out that it's a sin, but you're the only one who can redeem the sin, la 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 la. None of that happens here. Instead, we have constant rebuttal, and it shows that the idealizing of the saintly lover is not allowed to just stay on board without some kind of rebuttal. So the Petrarchan dream of, my lover is the god of the earth, she is everything, she teaches the sun to shine, the flowers to bloom, her loving me is everything there is, and because she clearly doesn't love me and I'm pretty unworthy of her, life is miserable, da-da-da-da-dum. Shakespeare says, let's undo all of this. And let's actually give the voice to Juliet. And the addition of Juliet, when you're thinking about gender norms, when you're thinking about love and gender here, this is one of the best things to show Shakespeare's revolution of gender. If I go through a list of poets, sonneteers of Shakespeare's time and before his time, we have Dante, male. Petrarch, male. Shakespeare, male. Spenser, male. Sidney, male. Etc., etc., etc. One could go down the list of Dryden, male. Go down the list of male sonneteers, and it's not just that they're male sonneteers, it's that they often favor male speakers. Naturally, if you're a man writing, you're more comfortable, on the whole, writing from a male perspective than writing a female perspective. This is a time that has tried to transcend these gender norms, but we still often see female writers focusing on female heroines more than male writers. And it just makes a certain amount of sense. You know, every creative writing program will teach you to write what you know, and clearly you know the experience of your own gender more than you know the experience of the other gender. At least I've not heard anyone disagree with this statement. So, at least more immediately. At any rate, the fact that Juliet not only comes into the sonnet and speaks back is a real statement about the gender imbalance of the sonnet form, where a man idealizes a woman who becomes like the object of his affection, but is really not allowed a voice, not allowed to really be a human being, because you can't be a god and a human being at the same time, for the most part. For the most part, Christianity has tried to play with that theme. But it's very important to think about the fact that Juliet here is saying, let's stop this. And the fact that she's saying this in the sonnet form is a revolution. I don't want to belabor point 3 yet. I think point 3 will just be interesting as another revolution. But point 4 is extraordinary. So I would say if you just think about this sonnet ends with a kiss. No sonnet can end with a kiss, because they're usually not on stage, and they are being written to an object who is, just by virtue of the process of writing, far away. And very, very, very often, I would say just roughly 90% of sonnets you read, 95, it's hard to quantify these things, there are so many sonnets out there, very, very often the object is much farther away than just down the street. The object is unattainable, the lover is unattainable, and this is the force and the problem of the sonnet form. It is driven by frustration, especially in Shakespeare's time. It's driven by frustration. It's nearly impossible to imagine a sonnet ending on a kiss. Partly because you're writing the sonnets to express your frustration with not being kissed. So the fact that, as the chorus will soon say, Romeo loves and is loved, the fact that this is finally taking a form from I so deeply want you and I can't possibly have you to I want you, hey, I want you too. We're both human beings, and don't treat me like a saint. I'd like to be an equal to you. And let's kiss is just an extraordinary revolution in a very small act. But because they're speaking in the sonnet form, it really pushes the envelope on what that form has been doing. And it's quite unique, I would say, to Shakespeare in this time. Now, point 3 is a little, I don't know. It's important to some things. I think it's important to understanding so let's go over point 3 a little bit. It's important to understanding Shakespeare's relationship to idealization, where I feel that the play overall, if I had to summarize, I would say it clearly is aware of the problems of idealization, and we'll talk about them at length. There are lots and lots of problems of thinking that the person you want to be with is a god, starting with the fact that they usually are not. And you will be disillusioned very quickly, but more importantly, it's kind of an unfair load of expectations to put on the person. And we see with Capulet what happens when your only son in terms S-U-N, son, your only daughter, who he calls his only son, disappoints you. When you're an ideal being and suddenly you act up against what is expected of you as an ideal being, the fall is much greater. It's just an expectations game as well that gets destroyed. So, what I will say about point 3 is the sonnet has a problem. It is generally a 1-2 punch. I set up the situation, I resolve it. I tell you what the problem is, I solve it. I tell you that I'm miserable, and then I tell you about another emotion that I have. It's 1-2. But the sonnet is 14 lines long, and it rhymes. So, it would be so much better if the sonnet could be 16 lines long, if you think about it. Because then you could have the first half, 8 lines, the second half, 8 lines. Instead, we're actually spending more time in the sonnet form. There usually is a turn on line 9. Now, I've done some quick numbers, back of the envelope calculations, and I would say about 4 or 5 sonnets in Shakespeare's collection and Philip Sidney's collections, and those are the only 2 I looked at from the period, have the turn on line 9. Which is pretty much as balanced as you're going to get, because you cannot make the turn on line 8, which would be a perfect halving, because then you're turning while still rhyming with the first section. So it's a little confusing, but a rhyme provides a certain kind of closure. You're sealing the lines, the 2 units of lines that rhyme. And so, to have half a rhyme in one side of the argument, the other half in another side of the argument, I've not seen people do this. Just basically turn on an odd line, on an odd rhyme. Just seems a little odd. So, basically, you try to create balances. One thing that Shakespeare did with his sonnets that really the Elizabethans often took to, which is really valuable, is taking the last two lines and indenting them. Why? Because there is that imbalance between the fact that you're spending most of your time on the premise, and then you turn from the premise. You make a volta, is the Italian term. Let me type down volta, from turning in dancing. And you then spend less time on what your final issue is. So what did Shakespeare do in his sonnets? He did this. He basically took the last two lines, he made them rhyme on their own, so they become heroic couplets. So two iambic pentameters that rhyme with each other. And from the name you can tell that that gives them a lot of force. To be heroic is very nice. And he would indent them. So you have the power of indentation on your side, as well as a couplet, a very summarizing couplet, a very concise couplet, to balance the fact that you've spent most of your lines talking about something else. Or not something else exactly, that would be silly, but start talking about where your starting point rather than your end point, which is very often a different place. Very often. There will be sonnets where you're staying at the same place. That's another solution for the imbalance, is just don't turn anywhere. And 116 is one of those sonnets. But I think this is another kind of solution, which is... Sorry, where did my screen go? Apologies. Screen, come back. Come back, screen. Oh, God. This is awkward. Apologies. This was going so well. Okay, good. So what he does is basically every time Romeo and Juliet speak, there's a turn. There's a constant countering. So Romeo will be talking about Juliet as a saint, trying to place her in that object position that the Petrarchan and Elizabethan sonnets so often like to put women in. Here I am, male poet, you, female poet, are my object of desire, and your only purpose in life is to inspire me to write poetry about you, and to give me all your love, as Bruno Mars would say, which you're not going to do. Partly because I've turned you into a saint, and that doesn't feel too great, if you're flesh and blood. Partly because I'm often, like, instead of talking to you, I'm writing you these sonnets. And these sonnets create the greater distance. Instead of all of this, this will be Romeo's tack, mixed in with some sexuality, obviously, and Juliet will constantly return us to the more pragmatic, more realistic, let's be semi-sensible, though Juliet does not like to be sensible for very long. She'll get out of this dialogue telling the nurse that she's learned a rhyme from someone, and you do see from time to time her loving the old oxymoron and really, really diving into Romeo's language of idealization. So it's not a clear-cut, she's an anti-idealist, he's an idealist, but here she's at least a counterbalancer. Okay, so basically we've gone over the first four lines. If I profane, if I make unholy, if I desecrate, just think about graffitiing. If I graffiti with my unworthiest hand, my hand can't possibly be worthy of touching you, this holy shrine, your hands, being a shrine, the gentle fine is this: I'll pay with a tender kiss. Just already the logic there, I think, part of Romeo's charm is he's aware that his logic is flawed. He's saying, if I've offended you, probably the best way for me to remedy this is by giving you a kiss. By kissing your hands. It's a little bit like saying, I took your wallet, and to make it up to you, I'm also going to take your purse. It's a little bit strange, but in the context of hands being unclean and lips being somehow cleaner, this has its own logic. But of course, part of this is just Romeo enjoying the concept. Alright, Juliet takes on board the metaphor. She says, okay, good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much. This will be her role so often. She'll say, your love is too much like lightning. You do wrong too much. If you're just fooling with me, if your will is marriage, then send for me. If your will is not, if your intentions are not as clean as your lips, then I don't want to be dealing with this. So you are treating your hand far too poorly. You shouldn't you shouldn't be idealizing me so much. Your hand is just fine, and shows mannerly devotion. So this is actually appropriate. And then she says, for saints have hands that palms' hands do touch. So the saints in their statues will have hands that you can worship by touching them. And palm to palm is Holy Palmer's kiss, which is referring to the fact that pilgrims, when they would go back from the Holy Land, they would come back with palm branches. So she's punning on palm branches and saying, we don't really need you to kiss my hands. It's good for us to have the hand as Palmer's kiss. And in saying Holy Palmer's kiss, she's already saying, we're kind of both pilgrims here. Like, up to that point, she has taken on board the idea that he's the pilgrim, she's the saint. She's saying, though, relax. It's okay. We can do this. We can interact like human beings. Just because you've treated me as a saint doesn't mean you can't actually touch me. Like the song says, I'm only human after all. But at the same time, kind of playing and saying, well, even if I was a saint, you could touch me, because we have hands. That pilgrims' hands do touch. And palm to palm is Holy Palmer's kiss. So, you can give me your palm branch or your palm, and we can have our holy kiss just by holding hands. No need to bring the lips into this game. But it's clear that it's very cute. Oh, and Romeo goes, you take my premise on board and move it forward. I too will take your premise on board and move it forward. And say, oh, saints have hands. Well then, don't they have lips? And also, their pilgrims have lips. So if the hands can touch, can't the lips touch? There's a bit of the rapper to Romeo. There's a bit of the lascivious. You can see the influence of Mercutio's line of reasoning, whereby you really need to be more physical with your lover. So he keeps bringing in the lips. And Juliet returns the knock. She returns it and says, they do have lips, which they use to pray. So yes, saints have lips. That doesn't mean they need to kiss. Cool. Then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. Part of why this is so cute, beyond the revolution here of the different voices and the fact that the female voice is allowed so many, witty, bantery repartees, these talkbacks, these answers to Romeo's lascivious suggestions and also worshipping language. Part of what's happening here is that they constantly challenge each other. So she'll say, we have hands, it's fine to touch hands, no need to bring lips. He'll say, but by the same token, we have lips. Would be good to use them, perhaps. And then she says, well, we can use them in prayer. We can, so changing the context on one another constantly and pushing each other and pushing each other. And now Romeo's going to move yet further and say, oh, there, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray. Grant thou lest faith turn to despair. And there's already a hint here in lest faith turn to despair of just how volatile, how fragile idealization is. Because he's basically saying, look, I'm in this mold, the Petrarchan mold, where you love someone and they don't love you back. And I'm praying to you. And with my lips, because you told me that that's what I'm supposed to do with my lips, is pray. And also my prayer is going to be a form of asking you, I'm praying for you to kiss me. But in that moment, lest faith turn to despair, there's something quite ominous there. There's something that says, look, this is so fragile. This can go wrong so easily for me, because you have a holy shrine, I'm an unworthy pilgrim, I've been rejected all my life, that's part of my thing, that's how I talk about myself, I think about myself as heavy and miserable because never loved, never returned, so please, this is gonna be, the idealism can only go so far. Grant yourself, give me what I need. So in some ways this exposes two things, both the fragility and the selfishness of the Petrarchan lover. How he is, again like Bruno Mars, to give me all your love is all I ever asked. This is one of the greatest lines of song I've ever heard, because it's so narcissistic. Grant yourself, just give it to me. That's what he's praying for. Lest faith turn to despair. So faith, 3 words away from despair. That's the problem of idealism, is it's super fragile, super selfish, depends on the person acting in an ideal way in terms of what you think is ideal. And if it doesn't, then immediately we go from one side of the equation, complete faith in the saint, to despair. No faith whatsoever. Okay. And then Juliet says, this is a bit problematic. He's taken this prayer theme a bit far. Let's see what I can do here. And it's so amazing from a gender perspective that Juliet is allowed quite so many comebacks, because Romeo is creative. If there's one thing you take from the Mercutio dialogues, it's that Romeo can answer a pun with a pun, no matter how many puns you throw at him. He is a courtly master. He's a master of language. And we see this even here in the 3 different moves that he makes, where it's like hands to lips, lips to prayer, and now prayer to kissing. Okay, so the fact that Juliet is his equal, and that this is a battle of equal minds, is really impressive, given that Juliet is speaking in the form that is particularly male, particularly associated with male dominance of females, ironically by idealizing them. And so it's amazing that she can still go, alright, I can't grant myself because you made me a saint, so we don't actually, as a saint, I'm a statue here, and they end up being statues, so it's an interesting foreshadowing there. As a saint, I'm not going to move, though, I will allow, because that's for prayer's sake, I might allow, this prayer, etc. And it's basically saying, listen, there's again, in Saints Do Not Move, there's just witty banter, but there's also a deep layer. There's almost always a deep layer to these little word games that they all play. And in this case, the game is, if, in terms of idealization, if you're saying that I'm a saint, that means I cannot move. Like, you can't have it both ways. You can't both turn me into someone infinitely superior to you and expect me to just act in a normal romantic relationship. One saints do not move. So on one hand, on one level, not on the one hand, on one level, yes, she is just going, I can't, like, start kissing you. I'm a saint. You've turned me into a statue. But on another level, she's saying, the process by which I've been turned into a saint is the same process that doesn't make it possible for me to be your equal, doesn't make it possible for me to move. It is actually one of the greatest condemnations of idealization is you've turned me into a kind of golden statue. Again, the end of the play is literally a turning into a golden statue of Juliet and Romeo. And that's not going to allow me to do what normal human beings do. Okay. So then Romeo goes, well, you don't have to move, I'll do all the work. Which is a bit, again, you can hear Mercutio at the back of his head saying to him, prick love for pricking. Hit love hard, and you'll figure it out. You'll figure it out if you don't take love in this idealistic fashion. So there's something where, again, I don't think either of them necessarily wins this debate. I think this debate is a stalemate, which is why they get to kiss. They get to kiss because, in part, they're of equal minds. The marriage of true minds. Whereas we never get to see Rosalind's mind the way it operates, so we don't really know if she's worth any of what Romeo's been saying about her. Whereas here we see as much evidence as we're gonna get that Juliet has the capacity to move through the witticisms and give as much as she takes, which is necessary to the taking of the prayer. So, and this ends on the stage direction. They kiss, a fairly rare stage direction in the Elizabethan stage, and an extraordinarily rare opening dialogue. I hope you would agree that a balancing of idealization and pragmatism, or if not pragmatism, at least a witty deflating, and saying, look, you yourself see the fragility of this, with lest faith turn to despair. And I'm saying to you, this is a problem for me. I'm not going to be able to move whilst I'm a saint in this configuration of me being the be-all and end-all of your life, the god of your idolatry, the sole reason for your existence. Doesn't leave a lot of space. I once read a book that had a preface that said, to my wife, I kid you not, this is what it said, my wife, my oxygen machine. And I thought to myself, I really would not want to be someone's oxygen machine. Just basically kind of a, how do I live without you kind of thing. It's not necessarily the best basis for romance, and in some ways Shakespeare is going through all of this to show us that actually part of the idealism is in having the two voices, is in having something of social equality, at least verbal equality, at least an equality of minds, and giving women a more realistic treatment. Not expecting them to be something greater than what they are, like the courtly tradition of the Elizabethan times so often did. Okay, so just to recap, taking a masculine form, giving it a female voice, taking a form where there's a very clear one-sided argument. If you turn to it, it's very often one-sided. Giving it both the idealism, the joy of the sainthood and the rebuttal. So where's the joy of the idealism? Well, the whole dialogue works. He does get to kiss her. She clearly, if she deflates his sainthood, she also picks up on the language and she learns that rhyme. And so there's clearly power to idealizing. We don't idealize people just for just to oppress them or anything. We idealize them because it's enjoyable and it makes sense of the intensity of our emotions in some ways, especially when we're younger, I think. And so Shakespeare is saying, yes, I will allow both of these sides to be heard. And I will allow this repartee to go on and kind of meet in the middle with a kiss. Meet with a kiss. Okay. So, and kind of where both sides are just willing, there's an amazing intermixing of their ideas, because Juliet is willing to take on the role of the saint even though she points out its limitations. They do not move. I can't, like, the lips are used in prayer. We're not gonna kiss saints, we're gonna pray to saints. That's good. But at the same time, Romeo takes on board Juliet's ability to move forward and does acknowledge, okay, then let's turn this whole holy ritual into a kissing ritual. There is something, it's hard to spell out exactly, but there is something self-aware in Romeo here. And then, especially I would say in Lest Faith Turn to Despair, there's an acknowledgement there of the vulnerability of that state. And Romeo would know a lot about despair at this point. So, yeah, just a great, great revolution of the sonnet form, brought about by bringing a female poet, giving her a voice equal to the Petrarchan voice, balancing the argument so you don't have this domineering structure of setting, volta, indented couplet that really sinks in the argument. For as long as men should live and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. None of that. Rather, let's meet in the middle. Much more middling. Much more negotiated. Much more balanced. Much more balanced than a male form. And finally giving these desires, showing that once you've turned down the idealism a little bit, you might actually get more true romance, more realistic romance happening if you allow for the female object to actually be a person rather than a god. Okay, so that's basically what I've got. Thank you so much for listening, and hopefully this should help with your GCSE prompts 2 and 3. Thank you so much. And now comes the embarrassing part where I try to seal the turn off file stop screen record. Never easy. You see my computer is frustrated with me to no end. And let me just say, I've really enjoyed, meanwhile, the classes we've had. Aha! Maybe. No? Yes. Okay. Have a great day, guys. And I'll see you this week or next.